Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Veldsman, and today I'm joined by Avinash Kohli, who is the co-founder of intalent.ai. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Avi, welcome to the HR Dialogues.
Thanks, teacher. Thanks for having me.
Avi, we like to get to know our guests a little bit more. Tell us a bit about yourself. What makes you passionate about HR and what brings you to us today?
So I've been in the HR industry for about 20 years. Worked with 3 organizations in my previous life before I co-founded intalent.ai, which is an AI platform for talent acquisition. We do AI agents for end-to-end of the talent acquisition process for organizations. But in my previous life, I worked with 3 organizations, Citibank, GE, and Boeing across India, US, and Singapore.
Avi, what career advice has stuck with you across your career and across these great organizations you've worked with?
Well, one thing which really stuck with me is the advice that I got from one of my mentors and managers at GE, where he said that, if you don't take care of your destiny, somebody else will. So you got to really take charge of your career, plan out what you need to do next, upskill yourself, raise your hand for projects, raise your hand for opportunities and initiatives, versus waiting for your manager, waiting for your organization to say, hey, Avi, go do this.
I love that. And I think anecdotally, we see in a lot of the career research that we do that's one of the key missing things for a lot of HR professionals is what does success look like in your career and what are the steps that you can then take. Love the fact that you also mentioned, if you don't manage your own destiny, other people will manage it for you. And I think a lot of people can definitely resonate with that. Avi, I want to move us into our topic that you and I are going to be talking about. And it's definitely about how HR strategy is starting to change. And we see definitely, and I can imagine also you being close to your clients in the AI space, that's having a significant impact on how we think about strategy, the role of HR in future. And, personally, out of my previous life as a CHRO, I always had a love-hate relationship with strategy. I know it's super important, but I always know that we need to struggle with that execution component around how do we translate strategy. And a lot of our latest research also points towards the fact that a lot of HR strategies are really well aligned with business, but people struggle in the execution piece to really set up those different foundations. So I want to start off just with a question, Avi, to you to say, what do you think are some of the challenges we face when we are trying to put together an HR strategy?
Yeah, I think it really starts with understanding how to shape or build an HR strategy, just at the very foundation of it, to be very honest, because there is a big risk of HR strategy being decided and shaped within the HR team with HR agendas in mind and HR metrics in mind, which could be, a lot of vanity metrics at times, versus a real impact on the business. And I remember that, growing up in my HR career, especially at GE, as an HR person, I was expected to be part of our weekly, monthly business review meetings, not just to wait my turn to update my HR page on that review, but to really listen to very intently on what's happening in the business and to really proactively think about, hey, this is what my business is going through. Is there an HR theme or an HR thread or an enabler to this challenge that they are facing or what they are trying to do with their business? What can I do? And secondly, it's not the job of the HR person only to drive HR strategy. Sometimes we feel that, hey, it's just my job, and it can be a very lonely place to be where, for example, you've got an employee survey, satisfaction survey, and people might look at the HR person to say, hey, why are survey scores down this year, for instance? Well, the HR person is communicating the employee policies, communicating aspects of the culture, trying to drive that, but it's really the accountability of the business leaders, the business managers, to drive that culture. So any HR strategy has to be co-owned and co-sponsored by business leaders together, hand to hand.
I like the point you make around, a business-enabled HR strategy, because I've also seen that, in a lot of organizations, we do business strategy and then we're like, okay, this now needs to inform the HR strategy. So you go away and you go do the HR strategy and come tell us what you are going to do. And I think that's definitely the wrong foot, to get started upon. And something I always asked my teams was, I said, but what business problem are you trying to solve, or what business problem are you trying to unlock? Because that is what the HR strategy should be doing. It's not about something separate in terms of our own metrics and processes and practices, but that connection is really, really important.
I'll give you an example of, I was an HR manager for one of the functions in an organization, and that function was the supply chain sourcing procurement function was essentially being brought together from multiple businesses together in a centralized fashion. And so as a result of that, there were people in the team who were being given much larger roles or a different set of roles than they were doing previously. And so I saw that, hey, these people have been doing a silo or a portion of this process or function. And now with this whole restructuring, they are going to be given much larger responsibilities. And it's our job as a business to prepare them, equip them with the right set of tools, mindsets, leadership to be able to be successful in their new roles. No business told me that to do.
Yeah,
I foresaw that. And we said, hey, why don't we literally look at developing a leadership academy for these set of people, for them to transition from what they were doing previously to what they are expected to do now. So that's something which we established. It didn't happen because business said, go do it. It's the proactive approach that we took to drive that.
I think you're spot on. Something that I made a very big mistake when I moved into my first executive role, and then very much my first board meeting that I had to go to, is I had this assumption that people had a base understanding of, firstly, HR, and then on the other side, how HR connects to business with the things that we do. So I almost didn't feel it necessary to explain, engagement is important because ABC, that's the outcomes that it's trying to drive. And I think your point about being proactive and talking from a business point of view, you want leaders to be able to do ABC to achieve this business goal. That is why, as HR, this is what we're going to invest in. And this is how we, again, as a collective, as you've mentioned, will get us there. And I think that's such a different mindset, because sometimes I find in the strategy domain, a lot of HR leaders want to almost prove themselves with how great their strategy is. And they have these robust, well thought through best practice type of strategies, but on the ground, it doesn't lead towards any change. And Ave, I want to ask you this question because it's something that frustrated me over the years, right? In terms of there's a process piece that I think is missing in strategy, right? In terms of when we do the HR strategy, you've already mentioned it has to be part of the bigger business strategy. It's not a standalone. But what other tips can you share around how we make the process a bit more adaptable, specifically in a world that's changing so quickly and is so uncertain?
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe just share one of the examples from my stint earlier on in my career. I was part of the HR leadership program at GE, and as a part of that, I was asked to do a stint at the corporate headquarters of GE in the US in an executive development role, working with the chief learning officer for the company and the entire executive development team, working on what we used to call the session C, or the overall company talent review for the then CEO, Jeff Immelt. And our job was to really look at, hey, what's really happening in the entire organization globally from a business standpoint and from a people standpoint, business by business, bubble that up right up to the corporate headquarters level. And then say, okay, this is what we are hearing from all the businesses. What should we drive now as an organization for the next year as an HR strategy? So as an example, after the 2008 financial crisis, GE had a big exposure on the G Capital side of the business, even though it was a very highly industrialized company with energy and other businesses. But because of that exposure, it really opened up areas where it was very vulnerable, and the organization had to go through a lot of restructuring. And we realized as an organization that our leaders need to listen more and to have intentional dialogues within their organizations to really keep their ear close to the ground for signals that are coming in early on, and to look at taking action to mend those things which are being bubbled up in the organization. So as a result of all of that feedback coming in, we changed the whole values, what we used to call growth values, made that into 21st century leadership attributes, and made that as a part of everybody's performance management appraisal system, where you're not just measured on what you do, but how you do it. And in the how, listening became a key factor of it. So leaders started to be assessed on that particular attribute. And then essentially you drive different initiatives, different strategy around leadership with those leadership attributes in mind as an organization. So to your point on really looking at, hey, what's coming in through the businesses, and then saying, okay, at an organizational level, what does it mean for us? What actions do we need to take? What do we need to drive organizational wide? And a lot of the initiatives came out of that that whole effort in that 2009 time frame to change the culture of the organization and to make it about a lot more bold and global in many ways. Yeah.
And I think that's a great example also around, a couple of things, Avi, that stands out to me. I think the importance of listening within the organization around what's really happening on the floor. And I think as part of your strategy process to be very clear around, are you following a bottom-up approach or are you following a top-down approach? But it still needs to go the other way. Even if you start top-down, it needs to come back up so that you can start gathering that feedback. Or on the other side, in the example you mentioned, actually start crafting from the bottom up. Something that I found that I think you've alluded to that is, I think sometimes people misinterpret the link between strategy and org design and the mandate of what we have around what the strategy aims to drive. I mean, I think in your example, especially in federated operating models, we very often find multiple strategies. So your overarching group or holding company strategy is very different than to what we see on the ground from a day-to-day point of view. So I think that understanding also of what your strategy needs to solve for is really an important part. And I want to move also a little bit, and you've kind of alluded to it already, Avi, around the importance of converting strategy into tangible metrics of impact and criteria of success. We talk to a lot of HR professionals and everybody's always fascinated with, KPIs, and I think they're crucially important. But sometimes I ask the question, if we go one level up, what does success look like? What does it feel like? How will we measure it if we know that the strategy is working? I don't know if you've had any experiences on how do we make it real for our stakeholders?
Aditya, just to go back to what you're saying on org design, because I think that's so important to really drive the business strategy. And as an example, when I joined Boeing as a head of HR for Boeing India, way back in 2016, there were about 93 people in India reporting to 53 global managers.
Wow.
And, it's a no-brainer to really figure out that there is no common India strategy at that stage. Right. And of course, my president of Boeing India at that point in time and the other leaders were really trying to shape the culture of the country to position it for growth. And so there was a lot of work done to pass a memo at the exco level in the company to say that anybody who is based out of India will report into India if we have to really grow within India. So that memo was passed. And as a result, decision-making and accountability started to happen more locally, close to the ground, where the customer was, or where we are hiring people for some of our global teams, R&D and other engineering teams. And as a result of that change in org design, we were able to establish the R&D center in Bangalore from about a smattering of 50 odd engineers there to about 1,200 in about a year and a half.
Wow.
And today there are about 5,000 plus engineers there, all because the org design was put in place. If that was not put in place, we would not have been able to go with speed, have the kind of execution, and make sure that we are doing what's right for the organization. So that's something which is, so org design is very crucial. And I have a couple more examples of that, but I won't go into those. I want to come back to your question on the KPIs and how do you really know that it's working, right? And one famous saying that we've been using all along is anything which gets measured gets done. And so how do you really measure the right things? Essentially within your realm of HR or business. And for example, looking at hiring, for instance, right? So if the goal for us is to really look at a lot more diverse sources of talent, for instance, or a lot more diverse backgrounds, if you don't measure that, how will you even know you're succeeding in that? Right? And then also about who has the metric, who owns the metric is very important. Because in my opinion, sometimes we can identify the right metric, but the accountability may be at the wrong place.
Something, that stood out for me that I definitely agree with is there's also a separation between who owns the metric, who's responsible for reporting on the metric, and then what is the language that we use when we talk about the metric. Because I absolutely believe, and I'm a firm believer that I think language shapes culture in an organization. So the way that we talk about certain things drives a particular narrative that then leads towards the culture. And I agree with you also around, I think it is about being very clear on what are the metrics that's really going to matter and how do they link back to the story that we want to tell about the strategy. And Avi, it's now my turn to bring you back to org design, because I should have warned you, I love org design. So whenever I have the opportunity to talk to anyone about org design, I definitely grasp it. But your point that you made is an interesting one for me, because often I think people start with saying, we need a strategy and we need to go. Whereas I sometimes think you need to, at times, prepare the runway before you can even talk strategy. And what I mean by that is obviously understanding what the organization looks like at the moment. And to your point, very often the org design or the decision-making authorities or just literally where people report and where they sit and who they are aligned to is actually not in place for you to be able to drive into the strategy part. And I often think that that's a core reason why the strategy process gets very, very tricky, because we haven't clarified who are actually the people and what are the conversations that they are having and what are they talking about at that point in time. So would love your view on, can I almost call it the pre-strategy phase? What are the things we need to think about before I can get everybody into a room and for us to talk strategy?
No, absolutely. I think it's the pre-strategy, of course, has to be about, what are your business objectives? Like, what do you really want to drive with your business? What are your business goals? And one of the examples that comes to mind for me is, in one of my previous organizations at GE. I mean, I really only worked with 3 companies, so I keep coming back to a few of those. But India in the GE landscape held a lot of potential for various reasons: growing economy, emerging market, etc., talent pool, and so on and so on. It had always been a great source of talent for GE globally. But as far as the business was concerned, there was always potential to do a lot more. And so, again, coming out of that 2009, 2010 sort of a time frame, the organization decided that they really wanted to grow within India in a lot more intentional manner than they had done previously in the last many years. And so that was the business goal. That we got to grow in this particular geography. From that goal was defined, okay, what do we need to do from an org design perspective, from a structure perspective, to enable that to happen? So earlier, all the different businesses in India used to report to their global or regional business leaders, with a India CEO who was more like a national office executive, who would have like responsibility to collaborate and bring everybody together, but no real authority of P&L, of budgets, of decision making, of headcount, of anything. Still very influential, but that is how it was structured.
Yeah, in a
and
different
it
way.
worked for a number of years, no doubt. And so the organization decided to change the structure. And as a result of it, the goal was to have a lot more collaboration within businesses, a lot more sharing of resources, a lot more synergies around common functions. For example, supply chain, the example I gave to you earlier, synergy that happened as a result of some of that across businesses, because you can now go to a supplier and say, hey, 3 of my businesses are buying from you, give us a better rate, for instance, for this material, right? For this valve that we need for our pipes, oil and gas pipes or something. So coming back to the overarching goal was, hey, how do we grow our businesses in the regions that hold potential? We know we can grow there. We've got presence there, but it's not firing on all cylinders. What's the right structure we need for that? Taking the bold step to make that structural change, communicating that appropriately, being prepared for chaos in the beginning sometimes, and then making sure it settles after a point in time so that it becomes a lot more functional from where it started. So I think that's crucial. That's crucial.
There's something that you've mentioned around the change process, right? Is I think organizations also make the mistake of, we go away, we go do strategy, and then we say, okay, we're going to start a change process to tell you where we're headed, the normal town hall approach of vision, mission, etc. Now, I'm not knocking those things. They are important, but I sometimes think that they are too late. I think you have to have a change process also that prepares the organization to say, we are going into a new strategy season. What went well? Where are we now? What are some of the changes that we are looking at? And then exactly to your point, to say, I think it provides a rationale for people why certain things need to move and certain blocks need to be in different places in order for the new strategy to land and for it to make sense for people. Now, I know a lot of people utilize strategy as the trigger for a lot of these changes, but I do think these things need to work a little bit closer together in that realization of how we set ourselves up in that way. Now, Avi, you've mentioned a couple of things that's really stood out to me, and I want to ask almost a final question a little bit closer to the type of work that you are doing now. So AI at the moment, we know, is part of everyone's strategy, and we can argue, buying licenses is definitely not a strategy, which I think a lot of organizations are just doing without having a plan in place.
It's a fascinating topic that I've been engaged in for the last 3 years, for sure. And I think it's such a fundamental shift to HR strategy that it's cliche to say it's the biggest wave and all that, but it is in reality a big fundamental shift on how work gets done within organizations. And let's start for a second on what that fundamental shift is. Today, there is an assumption that any task that gets done within an organization is going to be done by a human being as of now. But that's changing rapidly.
Yeah.
The skills, the tasks that will be done tomorrow could be done by human beings or could be done by AI agents far more effectively, or a combination. And so when you have a hybrid workforce of this kind, not the remote and the office kind, but a workforce where AI agents are working alongside the human workers, what does your organization look like? How do you even design an organization for that? How do you design an HR strategy for that? Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, said that in one of his keynotes recently, that the technology departments of tomorrow, of today, are going to be the HR departments of tomorrow. Now, what does that mean? That today, HR people are busy hiring human beings, onboarding them, making sure they're going through the training process, feeling good, etc., managing their life cycle. That's what HR departments are doing. Tomorrow, that same job will be done by IT departments of organizations, where they are figuring out which agent to onboard, how do I onboard them? How do they work with other agents or other human beings within the organization, etc. So this is going to such a fundamental shift sooner than later, and it's inevitable outcome. It's going to happen. And so HR organizations and departments need to really be at the forefront of driving that change and to understand what the art of the possible is, versus really sitting back and facing the onslaught of it and then trying to figure it. They have to be really proactive. I would say of all the departments in the organization today, with this change that is happening, the most proactive department that needs to be there is the HR department, none other. Not finance, not marketing, not supply chain. Of course, they will have their own, role to play, and they are, right? But HR is going to be at the forefront of how organizations are structured. And then as a result of it, what does that HR strategy look like? Does it include human beings? Does it include agents, etc.? How do you, when somebody leaves an organization, how do you even decide what to backfill for? Do you backfill for the same tasks, or do you backfill for a portion of the tasks versus what was there being done previously?
Avi, I want to wrap for us. I can't believe we're already at this point, but I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with you. A couple of things that stood out for me. I think we've spoke quite a bit about that there's almost a pre-phase to HR strategy that we need to get right. We spoke quite a bit in terms of the fact that there has to be a business-led HR strategy with ownership sitting in the right place, the right people involved around the table. We spoke quite a bit around the measurement piece in terms of showcasing its success and being pretty clear on what does good actually look like, and also touched a little bit just on the role of practices such as org design, preparing the organization, how change needs to come through in terms of how we prepare the strategic landscape and how we move from strategy formulation to strategy execution. Avi, from my side, thank you very, very much. Where can people follow you and the great work that you do, and where can they find out more also about the business?
No, great. Thanks, Teter. It was a very, very engaging conversation, and I myself didn't realize that we are at the end of it, and would love to continue this dialogue in the future. Of course, I'm there on LinkedIn. Company website is intalent.ai. So if somebody wants to see what we're doing, happy to get connected on LinkedIn. They can send me a message or get connected as well. So look forward and wish you all the best for your endeavors as well, Dieter. It's fantastic.
Thanks so much, Avi. And to all our listeners, thank you very much for dialing into the HR Dialogues, and look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Bye-bye.